outside of the Benghazi hearings and Vice President Biden's announcement this week, other big news rippled onto our radar, news that drastically impacts our ballooning prison population. On Thursday, the FCC took big steps in lowering inmate calling costs, which can go as high as $14 a minute, by capping rates and eliminating most add-on fees. Now, that news in and of itself was a big deal, but that wasn't the only criminal justice reform headline this week. A new group emerged this week, a group that, because of who its members are, could have a real impact on the goal of reducing incarceration rates. They call themselves Law Enforcement Leaders to Reduce Crime and Incarceration.
Our group has over 130 members from all 50 states of this nation. Police, prosecutors, sheriffs, state, local, and federal. All united to say we must seize this moment to reduce incarceration in the United States while keeping down crime at the same time. We can do it, and we know we can do it.
In its debut on Wednesday, the coalition offered 3 different areas for reform: more mental health and drug treatment, reclassification of crimes, and changing mandatory minimums for drug and nonviolent crimes. Joining me now is Benjamin David, District Attorney for the new Hanover County and Pender County in North Carolina. Benjamin, I understand that you and other members of this group were at the White House on Thursday, and I'm interested in what your takeaway from that meeting was.
Well, it was a great honor to meet with both President Obama and the Attorney General, who, like us, is from North Carolina, and to really have a meaningful discussion about how we can reduce both crime and incarceration in this country at the same time. It sounds counterintuitive, but we can actually do it by focusing not just on life and liberty, but also on the pursuit of happiness.
That's interesting. Follow up on that a little bit for me.
Well, it's about community engagement. We know, for instance, that 2 out of 3 people in prison today are high school dropouts. So we need to make sure that people are staying in school when they're kids. Stopping the school-to-prison pipeline is what many have called it, and my community has just passed that with our local school board and court officials. And then for the adults returning from prison, we need to have meaningful reentry. Right now, 98% of the people who we put in prison are getting out, and 66% of them are back in that prison cell within 3 years under the current rate of recidivism. That's completely unacceptable, and that's obviously unsafe for everyone. So getting them into jobs, removing the scarlet letter that the felony often carries through meaningful expungement laws for nonviolent felons and misdemeanors is absolutely essential to all of our public safety.
So, Maria, I want to have you respond to this, because I know that you've just been doing some of this work on your show.
Right. So there is more money spent right now in immigration, detention, and deportation and enforcement than all other federal law enforcement agencies combined. And I didn't see that talked about in this meeting at the White House. So Latinos also have one of the fastest growing rates of being put behind bars, every kind of bar.
Yep.
Jail, prison, and detention centers. So, you know, when you read in the New York Times that they're releasing several thousand prisoners, right, on the federal level.
And a third of them were going to be immediately deported.
Well, probably not immediately, because if they're losing money in where they're not being held in prison, then they're going to be put into a detention center where they're going to make some money before they're deported. And then, of course, we get to the whole question of who is actually a criminal within the context of immigrant and who is defined as a criminal by the administration. So I'm really happy that this conversation is happening. I mean, I'm just very glad. I think it is a manifestation of a mature democracy that we're discussing this. But there's this whole other thing that's happening in our country that we're not even seeing. Of course, we're reporting it on Latino USA, but on a mainstream national conversation, it's not being talked about.
So it's interesting because you went also to the profit piece of it. And Patrick, also one of the things we keep hearing is that the one thing creating a bipartisan coalition around any of this is this idea of how expensive incarceration is.
I mean, when you get Ted Cruz calling mandatory minimums draconian, you know you got some bipartisan
You know it ain't 1994 anymore, yes.
Right, and that's why.
It's
they realize it doesn't work, and there is the number of Republicans. You've got John Kasich in Ohio who instituted sentencing reform there, and there's no question it's bipartisan, and it's because of the cost. I mean, this is what has made this politically palatable right now.
Mr. David, let me come back to you.
Thank you. Actually, it's not even bipartisanship because that means you're surrendering something to meet in the middle. This is actually the rarest of all creatures in Washington. This is truly a left-right coalition. I actually have an identical twin brother who's the neighboring elected district attorney. He happens to be an elected Republican and I'm an elected Democrat, and we both feel the same way.
Mr. David,
reasons of reconciliation. Yes.
I feel like I'm just going to bring a camera on down to Wilmington next week because the fact that the two of you are identical twins, one Democrat and one Republican, both holding this office, just sounds like a story all by itself.
Well, but when it gets down to justice, we need to be taking politics out of it. I mean, whether it's for reconciliation, forgiveness, second chances on one side, or it's just bad business on the other, everyone agrees that we have to reform the system. And this really is about public safety. We want the right people in prison. There's no question. Rapists, murderers, armed robbers, everyone agrees that they should be in prison. Mentally ill, drug addicts, no one thinks that we should be warehousing those folks. And we need to do more, obviously, trust building within the community, both with our young people, with keeping them in school, and adults to break that vicious cycle of recidivism that we're seeing, the revolving door not just at the courthouse, but in our prison system.
Thank you to Benjamin David in Wilmington, North Carolina, with a fascinating story I'm going to learn more about. Still to come this morning, a Seventh Church fire set in the St. Louis area. And